and see whether we also, in our day and generation, may not perform something worthy to be remembered. That is our charge in this bill, and this bill fails. Mr. Chair, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlelady from Ohio reserves her time. The gentleman from New Jersey.
I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentlelady from Ohio.
Yes, Madam Chair, I yield 5 minutes to the ranking member of the Appropriations Committee, our very able ranking member of the full committee from New York, Representative Nita Lowey.
Gentlelady from New York is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, I first want to thank the chair, and I appreciate your important work on this bill, and I would like to thank the chairman of the full committee and the ranking member for your leadership and for your eloquent statement on this bill. It has been a pleasure for me to work with you, and I thank you so very much. I rise in strong opposition to this woefully inadequate bill. With an allocation of $30.4 billion, $2.8 billion less than the FY 2013 enacted level when adjusted for Sandy reconstruction, and a little more than $4 billion below the request, the consequences of following the majority's budget are crystal clear. The erosion of America's high-tech and scientific workforce, the loss of clean and renewable energy breakthroughs to countries like China, the abandonment of communities along our nation's coastlines and waterways, and with an 81% reduction in ARPA-E and a 60% or $700 million reduction to energy efficiency, renewable energy and energy delivery and reliability programs compared to last year, this bill will leave our scientific and technological workforce ill-equipped to tackle the great challenges of our time. Such drastic cuts will force the federal government to withdraw critical support for clean energy and renewable investments on the cusp of their maturity. These funding levels will inflict great pain on the American people, who will be left jobless with the exportation of America's clean energy and innovation economy to China and other foreign competitors. The consequence of allowing our competitors to gain ground is already evident. Last month, China's newest supercomputer, which was built almost entirely from Chinese parts, was deemed the fastest in the world, clocking in about twice as fast as the best American machine. If supercomputing is a measure of our scientific innovation, we are losing badly. The bill also dramatically underinvests by $300 million below last year in our nation's water resource infrastructure, leaving homes, businesses, communities vulnerable to damage from natural disasters like Superstorm Sandy. This decrease would compound prior cuts in 2011, 2012, 2013, totaling $769 million, of which $688 million was cut from the Army Corps construction account for projects we all know need to be done. Over 300 projects were suspended between 2011 and 2012. Are we going to abandon these projects forever? As a member whose district was affected by Hurricane Sandy, I can attest that prevention is cheaper and smarter than paying for reconstruction later. Additionally, decreasing investments in water infrastructure inhibits construction, job creation, and local businesses and individuals will not reap the indirect economic benefits that encourage critical investments in their communities. It is my firm hope that the majority will recognize that this bill does not provide a workable path forward and return to the spending levels agreed to under the Budget Control Act. To do otherwise is to purposely undermine efforts to support American job creation and economic growth. I urge my colleagues to oppose the bill. Thank you.
Gentlelady from New York yields back. The gentleman from New Jersey.
Reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlelady from Ohio.
Yes, Madam Chair, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, Representative Barra.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to applaud the committee for addressing a critical issue not just to my own hometown, but to our nation. Most know Sacramento as the capital of the Golden State. But what many don't know is that the Sacramento region, which sits at the confluence of the Sacramento and American rivers where they converge near the Bay Delta, has the second highest flood risk in the United States. Only New Orleans is at greater risk of flooding. And we know what happened in Hurricane Katrina. The Folsom Dam Joint Federal Project is vital to protecting our region from disaster. We must continue to fund these improvements to take pressure off our overburdened levees and keep people who work and live in my region safe. A flood in Sacramento would be devastating to the 1.4 million residents in our metropolitan area. The flood risk could result in closures of evacuation routes like Interstate 5 and Interstate 80, a shutdown of our international airport, and destruction of homes and hospitals, not to mention the irreversible tragic loss of life. Additionally, flooding could result in billions of dollars in potential damage, and it could take weeks or months to pump the water out of the region. Another area of crucial importance that I hope this body will soon address is the Sacramento American River levee system. Many of the levees in my area date from the 1870s, when farmers began building nearly 1,100 miles of protection around the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta to control floodwaters and create farmland. Today, these levees are in desperate need of critical repair and in desperate need to prevent a catastrophic disaster. We all witnessed the devastation caused by Superstorm Sandy this past November. However, unlike a slow-moving hurricane, a breach of the levees could occur with little or no warning. In fact, Robert B., a professor of engineering at the University of California, Berkeley, quotes, "In terms of damages, death, and long-term costs, a rupture in the Delta levees would be far more destructive than what happened in Hurricane Katrina."
I would be pleased to yield the gentleman an additional minute.
Thank you.
Additional minute.
This is a ticking time bomb. In 2006, Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger declared a state of emergency with the California levees. He signed an executive order directing agencies to identify and repair the levees. The citizens in Natomas levied themselves a tax, and they've already paid for, along with the state of California, 35% of the work. But we now need this body to allocate the rest to keep our region safe. As the chairwoman, or the ranking member said, it is better to prevent a catastrophe than to wait for that tragic loss of life. Addressing vital projects like the Sacramento area American River levees are crucial. It's what we should be doing. It puts people to work. It is time for us to come together as a body and get America working again and fund vital projects like the Sacramento American River levees. Thank you, and I'll yield back.
Gentleman from California yields back. Gentleman from New Jersey.
Reserve the balance of my time, Madam
Gentleman
Chairman.
reserves. Gentlelady from Ohio.
Yes, Madam Chair, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from California, Representative Janice Hahn.
Gentlelady from California, recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. You know, I'm disappointed that once again we're shortchanging American ports, businesses, and consumers by failing to fully utilize the receipts and the surplus of the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund on our ports. When our ports aren't well maintained, when we fail to support their infrastructure and their dredging, we threaten more than $3 trillion of economic output and over 13 million jobs. American consumers face higher costs, and American businesses have a harder time competing globally. Decades ago, Congress created a tax on the value of the goods imported through our ports to ensure that no American port would suffer under dredging. Yet for years, Congress has failed to fully use the receipts of this tax on keeping our ports in good order. It has gotten so bad that the American Association of Port Authorities estimates that the full channel dimensions of our nation's ports and harbors are available less than 35% of the time. Ships are constantly forced to light load or wait for high tides to enter U.S. harbors, and those inefficiencies and added costs ripple all the way back to the wallets of average Americans. I don't think it's right to make Americans pay for a tax and pay again for our failure to use that tax that we promised. We may be increasing the amount of the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund we are spending on ports in this bill, but it's still $700 million less than what our ports are owed. By the start of FY 2015, we will owe our ports nearly $9 billion that should have gone to the investment in our ports that would create jobs and keep us globally competitive. We can't wait anymore. We need to fully utilize the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund as soon as possible. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady from California yields back. The gentleman from New Jersey.
If you want to close, you can close and ask them if they're going to close. Ask Captain.
May I ask the ranking member, Ms. Capter, are you prepared to close?
Yes, Mr. Chair, we have no further speakers here.
Neither do I. We have one, but we can't find them. So, indeed, I'm prepared to yield back if you are.
I am prepared to yield back my remaining time.
Gentlelady from Ohio yields back her time. Gentleman from New Jersey
As well, yield
yields back his time. All time for general debate has expired, and pursuant to the rule, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. During consideration of the bill for amendment, the chair may accord priority and recognition to a member offering an amendment who has caused it to be printed in the designated place in the congressional record. Those amendments will be considered read, and the clerk will read.
Be it enacted, the following sums are appropriated for the fiscal year 2014, namely, Title I, Corps of Engineers, Civil, Department of the Army, Corps of Engineers, Civil. Appropriations shall be for authorized functions pertaining to river and harbor, flood and storm damage reduction and related efforts. Investigations, $90 million. Construction, $1,343 million. Mississippi River and tributaries, $249 million. Operation and maintenance, $2,682 million. Regulatory program, $193 million to remain available until September 30th, 2015. Formerly utilized sites, remedial action program, $104 million. Flood control and coastal emergencies, $28 million. Expenses, $182 million to remain available until September 30th, 2015. Office of the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works, $5 million to remain available until September 30th, 2015. Administrative provision. The revolving fund shall be available during the current fiscal year for purchase of passenger motor vehicles. General provisions, Corps of Engineers, Civil. Section 101. None of the funds shall be available through a reprogramming of funds.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Ohio seek recognition?
Yes, I move to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Yes, I thank the gentlelady for yielding to me. And I just wanted to place some additional information into the record as we proceed with amendments. And in looking at our bill, in looking at some of the accounts, especially for the water accounts, energy and water accounts, and the general provisions, there was an excellent article in this week's International Herald Tribune. And it talks about sound investments. And I would like to submit it, and we'll just read a portion of it very briefly here. It talks about how the rate of economic growth in Germany is surpassing our own just now, and the unemployment rate as a result has dropped to 5.3% and falling further, much lower than in the United States. And it investigates why that is the case. And it talks quite a bit here about the German economy having made investments whose future benefits will far outpay repayment costs. And this bill, in its accounts, essentially should be doing that, but unfortunately cuts back on some of the most significant for job growth. The article goes on to say that the U.S. economy is still in doldrums, and that's because many of the needed workers and machines are now idle. If the country waits, it will need to bid them away from other tasks. And also, because of the sluggish economy, the materials required for the work are now relatively inexpensive. So this is really the time to encourage investment in our economy to lift the entire system. The article goes on to talk about the fact that in Germany there had been certain austerity backers, they call them, who urged preposterously that infrastructure repairs be postponed until government budgets were in balance. But it says, would they also tell an indebted family to postpone fixing a leaky roof until it paid off all of its debts? Not only would the repair grow more costly with the delay, but the water damage would mount in the interim. Families should pay off debts, yes, but not in ways that actually increase their indebtedness in the longer term. I found this article particularly instructive as we move amendments to the floor and move this bill forward. Austerity advocates in the article object that more deficit spending now will burden grandchildren with crushing debt. That might be true if the proposal were to build bigger houses and stage more lavish parties with borrowed money. But in fact, the dollars were being invested in the nation in projects that were creating opportunity and infrastructure that would advance the worth of the nation in decades hence. So I think that we ought to think about this as we proceed title by title in this bill and ask ourselves the question why it is that many of the important accounts, such as the Corps of Engineers, and several of our speakers today have referenced those, has been cut by $104 million compared to this year's enacted level, and falls far short of the investments that we need in one of the fundamentals in the country, and that is in water systems. So, Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that this article be placed in the record from the International Herald Tribune.
Will be covered under general leave.
I thank you very much. I also wanted to point out and place in the record some of the severe cutbacks in this bill with more specificity. The renewable energy reliability and efficiency accounts is $971 million less than the 2013 enacted level and $1.96 billion less than the President's request. The Department of Energy Office of Science is $223 million less than 2013's enacted level and $499.8 million less than the President's request. The Advanced Research Projects Agency is $215 million less than the 2013 enacted level and $329 million less than the President's request. The funding for environmental cleanup is $243 million less than the 2013 enacted level and $133 million less than the President's request. The nuclear nonproliferation account is $334 million less than the 2013 enacted level and $40 million less than the President's request. In terms of the Army Corps of Engineers, it is $104 million less than the 2013 enacted level. And in the water resources projects within the Department of Interior, there is a $104 million reduction less than the 2013 enacted level and $85 million less than the President's request. So when we think about the cumulative impact of it, it is just extraordinary. And I would ask unanimous consent that this data be placed in the record as well.
It will be covered under general leave, and the gentlelady's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I ask to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I rise to commend the Committee on Appropriations for its leadership in resolving the nuclear waste issue. This is certainly a very crucial issue for all Americans. Last year, I would remind us that the House voted 326 to 81 in favor of the Shimkus Amendment to increase the bill's funding for Yucca Mountain license review. This year, the committee has once again reflected the will of the House, not just by funding the license review, but also providing the Department of Energy the authority to transfer funds to the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And it's my understanding that this provision gives both DOE and the NRC the flexibility to make sure that the Yucca Mountain licensing case gets optimum resources where needed to make real progress in meeting our nation's need for a safe repository to isolate our spent nuclear fuel and high-level defense waste. And I yield to Mr. Frohlenheisen.
The gentleman from Michigan is correct. The Department of Energy would have the flexibility to transfer funds as needed to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, either from funds appropriated in our bill or from funds previously appropriated for this purpose that remain unspent. This language will also allow the Department of Energy to reprogram funds and subsequently transfer them to the NRC for this purpose, if necessary, to ensure that no one can claim that access to adequate funds is a barrier to completing the review of the Yucca Mountain license application.
Well, I thank the gentleman from New Jersey. This approach really does build on last year's momentum to get the job done. Consumers and taxpayers have paid over $15 billion, that's B as in big, to find out whether Yucca Mountain would be a safe repository for civilian spent nuclear fuel and defense nuclear waste. They deserve an answer. Yes, they do. And under this bill, they're going to get one. I would commend all the members of the Appropriations Committee for this, and I would urge all members to vote yes on this appropriation bill for FY 2014 so that we can make additional resources available to perform the critical work.
Would you be good enough
to
yield to me?
Again to the gentleman from New Jersey.
I thank the gentleman for his comments, and I'd also like to recognize his leadership on this issue as the chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. He's worked hard with his colleagues to ensure that the will of the people is heard. The administration must apply the law that Congress already enacted and get this job done. We look forward to working with the gentleman to get this appropriation enacted and to get this license wrapped up at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And I yield to you back.
Well, I just want to say again, I want to compliment you and your staff. This has been a major issue for us for a good number of years, something that needs to get done. I look forward to continuing that strong relationship as we look to the future, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Michigan yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon seek recognition?
Rise to strike the last word.
And the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The dispatch with which the committee has moved forward made it not possible for me to offer the amendment that I was going to offer formally. But I just intend to deal with the issue very briefly for the committee and look forward to trying to work with the committee going forward. 6 years ago, in Section 2032 of WARDA 2007, Congress directed the President to issue a report describing the vulnerability of the United States to damage from flooding. In addition to examining the risks to public health and property, Congress instructed the President to undertake an assessment of existing programs to address flooding, the effectiveness of these programs, and recommendations about how to improve them. Unfortunately, despite almost daily reminders that we see about flooding in the news, this report has yet to be written. The President has requested funding for this study in its annual budget request from the Corps of Engineers. The fiscal year 2014 budget calls this study a, quote, high priority evaluation of the nation's vulnerability to inland and coastal flooding and of the effectiveness, efficiency, and accountability of existing program strategies. I agree. And the amendment that I would have offered would seek to provide funds to the Corps to finally undertake the study. The need is clear. Flooding is America's most common natural disaster. From 2002 to 2011, total flood insurance claims averaged more than $2.9 billion a year. Last year, a new FEMA report indicated that rising sea levels and increasingly severe weather are expected to increase the areas of the United States at risk by 45% by the end of this century. The federal government, led by FEMA and the Corps of Engineers, plays a significant role in flood damage reduction and emergency response. Reducing flood damage is one of the core missions of the Corps. It builds levees, flood walls, shore protection projects, and restores natural floodplains. However, our current understanding of the actions necessary to reduce vulnerability to flooding and therefore reduce the amount that we spend to respond to flooding is lacking. If we could do this report, it would be very helpful. The Corps of Engineers spent $1.5 billion annually on flood control activities for the last decade, and Congress has provided over $26 billion in additional supplemental appropriations responding to flooding and other natural disasters over the same period. Despite massive expenditures on flood control, flood damages have increased at alarming rates. Long-term average flood damages are more than double what they were earlier this century. Obviously, we're not doing everything right. The cost of the study would only be $1 million. The investigation program is being funded at $90 million. In order to reduce government spending, we need to know how much money we are continuing to throw at projects that may or may not help. I would hope that we could work with the committee to make sure that we have the best information available before the Corps commits to even more projects. I would hope that we could work to make sure that this comes to pass. It will make the job of the committee easier and will make a difference for Americans across the country. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Oregon yields back. The clerk will read.
Page 9, line 15, Section 102. None of the funds may be used to award any contract that commits funds beyond the amounts appropriated for that program. Section.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
To strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
The rapidity with which this process is moving, we might be dealing with the transportation rather than the energy and water appropriations. And therefore, my amendment apparently passed without an opportunity to present it. We just heard our colleague from Oregon speak to the issue of flooding. I represent 200 miles of the Sacramento River, yet this bill ignores the need for this Congress to protect human life. This bill spends $7,670 million on nuclear weapons and cuts the money for levee protection. Human life is at risk in my district, and yet this bill ignores the reality of flooding. When a flood occurs in my district, it's not in the summertime, it is not warm water, it is very, very cold water, and thousands of lives are at risk. Yet the majority cannot seem to find the money necessary to protect human life, but plenty of money for nuclear weapons. Is this the priority? $7.6 billion for nuclear weapons and not enough money to protect the lives of the citizens of this nation from real danger, real floods, is really going to happen, gentlemen and ladies of the majority. The Corps of Engineers budget is decimated, and for the last 3 years we've not been able to get one new project, even though human life's at risk. Is that the priority? Apparently human life is not. Projects in my district, The Hamilton project for the last 3 years has been in the President's budget. Yet, no new starts prohibitions place us in a dangerous situation in my district. Apparently, we need more nuclear weapons, but not more levies. Is that the majority's position? $7.6 billion for nuclear weapons and not enough for a $15 million project to protect the citizens of Hamilton County, Hamilton City. You should be ashamed that that's your priority. This particular appropriation bill is an abomination. It is a disgrace. It is a representation of the wrong priorities. But yet that's what you want to do. I suppose if this had not been a railroad and you were moving things so fast, I would have had an amendment opportunity to simply say that new starts, vital to the life and well-being of citizens in this nation, should be in this bill. But I didn't have a chance to do that because of the railroad you're operating here. Run it as you will, but at the end of the day, there will be human life at stake, at risk, and quite likely, floods in the 200 miles that of Sacramento River and its tributary that I represent. This is wrong-headed. This is wrong. Your priorities could not be worse. You should be ashamed that this is the priority you put. Levees will not be built. Human life will be at risk. But presumably that's what you want.
Will the gentleman yield? I wonder if for those that don't come from your part of the country, Congressman Garamendi, talk about what it's like to face that possibility of non-repair of the facilities that you are discussing.
Well,
they'll direct their comments through the chair.
I'd be happy to address my comments to the chair. Madam Chair, the priorities that are in this bill are dead wrong. Natomas in Sacramento, 20-foot potential water in the wintertime with the water temperature somewhere in the 40 to 50 degree range. Perhaps human life can last 10 minutes, maybe. But that's the priority. Hamilton City, the same situation. Yuba City, Marysville, the same situation. A winter storm in California and a levee break is deadly. This is not New Orleans where you can stay in the water for a few hours. This is cold water temperature. And yet, Madam Chair, the majority's position is to build more nuclear weapons and not to build levees. Okay. When the flood occurs, and it will, what will happen? Could we not take just $100 million out of the nuclear weapons account and put it into the levees account, into the Army Corps of Engineers? Apparently not.
Gentleman's time's expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
I'd like the last word.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the energy and water appropriation bills on the floor, which I think appropriately reflects the need to spend taxpayer dollars responsibly in light of our current budgetary problems. Total funding in this bill represents a decrease of $2.9 billion below the fiscal year 2013 enacted level and $700 million below the post-sequester level. While funding is reduced, this bill still provides critical resources for important projects and programs that ensure our nation continues to have access to affordable, reliable, and clean water and energy. The bill also provides much-needed funding for our country's flood control projects that are constructed by the Army Corps of Engineers. In my own district, California 42nd District, the home of the Santa Ana River Main Stem Project, which is one of the largest Corps projects west of the Mississippi River, I'm pleased that the Corps and the Energy and Water Subcommittee continue to recognize the project's importance to providing adequate flood protection to Southern California region. Additionally, in Southern California, we recently lost 2,200 megawatts in power generation with a permanent shutdown of the San Onofre nuclear power plant. A significant generation shutdown of this nature creates tremendous uncertainty for ratepayers through our region. Of course, energy production challenges are by no means exclusive to Southern California. That's exactly why the energy programs funded in this bill are necessary. And I'm particularly pleased that our subcommittee has funded energy programs by taking an all-the-above approach that includes renewable, nuclear, and fossil fuel. Americans rightfully expect affordable access to clean, affordable, and reliable energy and water. As a member of the Energy and Water Subcommittee, I believe we've done our best to meet those expectations with this bill, and I encourage all my colleagues to support the bill. In closing, I just want to thank Subcommittee Chairman Friedlandhausen as well as Chairman Rogers for their leadership in crafting a good and responsible bill. And with that, I yield back the balance of
The gentleman from California yields back. Does the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I ask to strike the last word.
And so the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Madam Chair, I would just like to raise an issue here with the amount of money in this bill that we are appropriating for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers construction account. I have heard several of my colleagues here speak earlier on individual projects in their districts that affect their constituencies, and I am totally in agreement with that on both sides of the aisle. But I do want to acknowledge the priority that should be recognized in this bill, and that is of recognizing the impacts of these large coastal storms. I happen to represent the Port of Boston and the communities south of Boston along the South Shore, a beautiful area, great number of towns with great history there, and that while they were not affected to the degree that New York and New Jersey were during Hurricane Sandy, Superstorm Sandy, a lot of their infrastructure was damaged to the point of near collapse. So there's a great need for seawall reconstruction. They withstood that impact. They did the job that they were intended to do at the time that they were constructed. But I feel that this bill, in its current form, continues to undermine the ability of the Army Corps of Engineers to keep pace with the needed maintenance and reconstruction of our infrastructure. So I just want to call to mind the whole initiative here and what our priorities should be. We are, in many cases across the country, the beneficiaries of people who came before us and made the necessary investments in infrastructure. They saw the need, and we today, and up to today, have enjoyed a competitive advantage against some of our international neighbors because our infrastructure is there. And there is a definite increase on the number of these catastrophic storms. It seems like in my area we have 100-year storms every 3 or 4 years now. There's definitely something going on with climate change and the intensity of these storms. It seems appropriate that we try to recognize the need here. I notice we're putting an awful lot of money into fossil fuel research and not nearly enough money to recognize the impact that climate change has already had on a lot of our coastal areas. We should be reinvesting in that infrastructure so that we're not faced with the total collapse that we saw in New York and New Jersey with Superstorm Sandy. So I just would call on my colleagues across the aisle in a request for bipartisanship and for recognizing the long-term interests of Americans across the country, Democrats and Republicans, in making sure that we use a common sense approach in this bill. And I think we are off course with respect to the defunding of the construction account for the Army Corps of Engineers, not just for my district. I'm not saying that just for the communities that I represent who do have considerable need because of recent storms. I'm talking about all across the country. I'm talking about Republican districts as well as Democratic districts. And we have a wonderful organization here in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. They do fantastic jobs. we get more than our money's worth. You know, we put $1 into the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and we get $5 back or $7 back, depending on the project. And I think it's just wise stewardship to make sure they have the resources necessary to perform the reconstruction in some cases and maintenance in other cases of the seawalls along the east and west coast to make sure that we are indeed prepared for these storms that are inevitably coming. So with that, I have an amendment later on at the appropriate time in this bill where I'll be asking for additional money for the construction account of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And with that, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Massachusetts yields back his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a fiscally responsible bill. It cuts $2.9 billion below the fiscal year of 2013 enacted level, and it's $4.1 billion below the President's request. That's an impressive achievement working in this very difficult fiscal environment that we're in today. But what I really find impressive about the bill and the work that's been done by the subcommittee chairman and the chairman and the Appropriations Committee is the fact that this bill sets some very good priorities. In fact, there's $2 billion for navigation projects and studies to advance American competitiveness and our ability to export, which is critical for growth in this U.S. economy. It includes $1 billion of appropriation from the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. This is a record level. This is $200 million more than what we saw in fiscal year 2013, something that's absolutely critical because we know that our federal ports, our harbors are essential if we're going to be able to ship goods overseas. Getting the dredging funds is absolutely necessary because we lose economic efficiency. In fact, on the Mississippi River, every time we lose a foot of draft, it's about $1 million per ship per day in lost economic activity. If we're going to get this economy growing, create value, create jobs, we have to export. And to export, we have to have the waterways that allow us to do that. According to the Army Corps of Engineers, nearly 1,000 federal ports and harbors have not been adequately maintained due to inadequate budgetary allocations over time. This bill now takes a strong step forward to correct that. And I want to thank Chairman Rogers for this encouraging step forward, for bringing attention to the fact that America's infrastructure, its ports, its locks, its dams, its inland waterways are old, have not received the appropriate investment, and have often been ignored. It's cost us time, it's cost us money, it's cost us economic growth, and it's cost us jobs. Clearly, if we're expanding these trade agreements, looking at the Pacific with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, looking at a transatlantic agreement, we have to have our ports, our harbors, our waterways working at maximum efficiency if we're going to grow this economy. Also, I want to compliment the chairman of the subcommittee and the full committee as well for including language from my colleague, Congressman Rodney Alexander. This is language included in the bill requiring the Department of Energy to report on its plans to address the backlog of natural gas export applications, liquefied natural gas export applications, and to encourage the timely completion of this approval process. Given the fact that so many of these applicants have been waiting for well over a year to get a decision from the Department of Energy, it's just unacceptable to have this kind of a backlog at a time when this is going to help us expand trade, help improve our trade deficit. It will help create jobs. It will help us actually help, interestingly, help stabilize the price of natural gas, so we'll see more drilling and helps our energy security in the long run. So by expediting this process, getting the Department of Energy to be held to account on the backlog of these permits is critically important because these companies have invested millions of dollars in this permitting process, and to be sitting in limbo is just simply unacceptable. And so I am very, very happy that Congressman Alexander's language has been included in this base bill, and I want to thank the chairman for doing this. And with that, Madam Chair, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Clerk will read.
Page 9, line 22, Section 103.
Madam Chair.
Gentlelady from Ohio.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Yes, Madam Chair, I would like to yield an additional 5 minutes to the very able gentleman from California, Congressman John Garamendi.
Gentlelady may not yield blocks of time. The gentlelady may not yield blocks of time.
I would like to just yield to the gentleman.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A few moments ago, I talked about priorities. $7.6 plus million for nuclear weapons. We just heard a gentleman discuss the issue of locks and levees and ports. Projects in my district for the ports, for deepening the channels, for rebuilding and expanding the economic activity of this nation are not going to be funded. Do we really need to spend an additional $7.6 plus million on nuclear weapons when we have over 8,000 of them, Russia 7,000, China 250? Do we really need to spend the money there, or do we need to spend it on our economic activity, as the gentleman just said? But there's not enough money in the Corps of Engineers budget to provide for all of the ports, all of the improvements that are needed so that our ports on the West Coast, the East Coast, Gulf Coast can be competitive. But apparently we have enough money. Why don't we take some money out of this program and put it where it will be immediately beneficial? It's a matter of priorities. Where your money is where your heart is. Okay. It's not where my heart is. You talked about all of the above energy. We ought to talk about all the above energy. But yet, ARPA-E, where we create the new science, the new technology, the new programs that will provide us with new energy sources, improved energy sources, and the improvement of old energy sources. Gutted. Gutted. 87% reduction. The Office of Science, where we do real research, where we really can do all of the above, whether it's coal or oil or renewables, gutted, a 73% reduction. Where are our priorities? Where are the priorities of the House of Representatives? Is it to build more nuclear weapons that by the grace of God we will never use? 8,000 of them? Or is it to build a levee? Or is it to make sure the researchers at our universities and laboratories have the money that they need to really deal with the problem of the future, which is climate change? It's about priorities. Madam Chair, it's about priorities, and I ask my colleagues, through you, of course, what are the priorities? They're listed very clearly in your legislation.
Will the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield back.
I would just like to reclaim a couple seconds here and just place on the record for the Army Corps of Engineers, the gentleman is correct. If we look back to the years 2011 and 2012, the bills terminated or suspended over 300 projects across this country. That is not an insignificant number. That is a very significant number. It's one of the reasons that we weren't able to put in new starts, because we've got so many other wounded and casualties standing in line waiting for assistance across the country, including the communities you represent.
Thank you. And I might just point out that with sequestration this year, we took $250 million out of the Corps of Engineers budget. And so we're building on a lower base. This is going to be tragedy and tragic. But, Madam Chair, these are our priorities. Well, excuse me. These are not my priorities. These are the majority's priorities. I yield back.
Thank you. And I yield back my remaining time.
Gentlelady yields back her time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I rise to strike the last word.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and appreciate the opportunity to come down and speak about a very important issue that I know is important to you as well as myself, because the Great Lakes are facing a crisis right now. The Great Lakes Navigation System is a critical international waterway that extends from the western part of Lake Superior. In fact, that point in the western part of Lake Superior is further west than St. Louis, Missouri. Further west than St. Louis, Missouri, the gateway to the west, and it extends all the way along the St. Lawrence Seaway to the Atlantic Ocean, a distance of over 2,400 miles. 2,400 miles, and this portion, this U.S. portion of the system includes 140 harbors, 60 of which are deemed as, quote, commercial, and 80 as recreational and harbors of refuge, and over 600 miles of maintained navigation channels. The system can handle 200 million tons of cargo that generate and sustain nearly 130,000 good-paying jobs in the 8 Great Lakes states, not to mention what happens to our friends to the north and east in the Canadian provinces, and how important that relationship is with that trade that goes on. And while the Army Corps of Engineers National Operations and Maintenance account has increased by 20% from 1995 through 2012, the annual budget for the Corps' maintenance of harbors and navigation channels in the Great Lakes has remained virtually unchanged during that same period. Well, we all know that those challenges that we're facing as a nation financially and fiscally, but that, Madam Chair, does not seem right or fair to me, and it certainly is not an acknowledgement of the importance of the Great Lakes to our vital economy. You know, there's 18 million cubic yards of sediment right now clogging the Great Lakes ports and waterways, and which has reduced the amount of cargo shipped by over 500,000 tons over the course of the navigation season. To put this number into context, I own a gravel pit. All right, I have dump trucks that go out and around, and a normal-sized standard dump truck is 10 yards. If you're going out there, to put in context, 18 million yards of sediment, that would be like 1.8 million dump trucks loads of sediment that is out there right now. And in fiscal year 12, the Corps received $45 million for maintenance dredging and $95 million for navigation structural maintenance in the Great Lakes. But it's going to cost more than $200 million to restore ports and waterways to what their design depth and width is. In order to make up for that shortfall, the state of Michigan recently authorized over $20 million, state funds only, and emergency dredging funds to ensure that commerce, tourism, and jobs remained available in port cities, big and small. I commend the state of Michigan. However, the federal government has a constitutional requirement to maintain those interstate commerce through those ports and in and among the states as well as internationally. The funds that come from the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund are paid for as a user fee of 0.125% on the value of cargo shipped. And in the previous year, that equated to $1.7 billion, which was paid into the fund, but only $804 million was used for dredging and maintenance of our harbors because the trust fund, frankly, has been raided over the years to pay for other projects and unrelated projects sometimes. But I'd like to thank my colleague for working towards a solution to this problem by reprioritizing spending, which is really what this is all about. We know that we have to reprioritize and reflect a $1 billion disbursement from the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund to the bill and encourage funding in the future. And I know that there's some specific language, and Madam Chair, had I been able to be down here, I would have offered an amendment that would have clarified making sure that $30 million that is put in for small ports and subsistence ports would have been more clear. But in the meantime, we must act before the crisis in the Great Lakes grows worse. And I thank my friend from New Jersey for the work that he has done on this bill. And while I'd prefer more clarity, I'm satisfied with the intent of the committee to help our ports, big and small. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time.
Madam Chair,
gentleman from New Jersey.
Move to strike the last word. And
the gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Let me say to the gentleman from Michigan, I want to thank him for being a strong advocate for sufficiently maintaining his waterways and the nation's waterways. These ports and channels are very important not only to the Great Lakes economy but to our national economy. And I want to commend him for his attention to the needs of his constituents. He's extremely knowledgeable from a professional point of view, and certainly as a member of Congress devoted to the needs of his constituents. The committee has heard from many members including those from the Great Lakes, concerned that the administration's budget processing has left small, remote, substantive ports across the nation unable to continue to conduct business due to inadequate or oftentimes non-existent maintenance. These are what prompted the committee to include a minimum of $30 million to be made available to such ports. The Great Lakes ports will certainly be eligible for this funding. I believe our bill addresses his concerns to the greatest priority possible in light of other priorities which he mentioned in our bill, which is obviously balancing the federal budget and controlling spending. I want to thank our colleague for bringing the concerns of the Great Lake ports to our attention. We'll do our level best to work with you. We honor your request, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New Jersey yields back his time.
Thank you.
Clerk will read.
Page 9, line 22, Section 103. None of the funds shall be used to award any continuing contract that commits additional funding from the Inland Waterways Trust Fund. Section 104. Not later than 120 days after the Chief of Engineers report.
This is a gentleman from Washington. Seek recognition.
Madam Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk. We're not?
Has the gentleman sent his amendment to the desk?
I just a moment ago sent it up there to the here.
Gentleman is advised we have not yet reached that point in the reading.
Thank you.
Clerk will read.
Shall submit the report to the appropriate committees of the Congress. Section 105, the Secretary is authorized to implement measures recommended to prevent aquatic nuisance species from dispersing into the Great Lakes.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk. It's, my district has shoreline and Lake
Clerk
Erie.
will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Kelly of Pennsylvania, page 10, line 21. After the period, insert the following. Further, the Army Corps of Engineers, in coordination with the Director of the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, and the United States Geological Survey, shall lead a multi-agency effort to slow the spread of Asian carp in the Ohio River Basin and tributaries by providing high-level technical assistance, coordination, best practices, and support to state and local government strategies to slow and eventually eliminate the threat posed by Asian carp. To the maximum extent practicable, the multi-agency effort shall apply lessons learned and best practices, such as those developed under the Management and Control Plan for bighead, black, grass, and silver carps in the United States, November 2007, and the Asian Carp Control Strategic Framework.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
I reserve a point of order on the gentleman's amendment.
Point of order is reserved. The gentleman from Pennsylvania recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to come forward and talk about this amendment. Part of the district that I represent is Lake Erie, and it's also, I have the Ohio River watershed. So my amendment would have allowed the Army Corps to combat the Asian carp in the Ohio River. There are over 30 states affected by Asian carp, and this invasive fish is already throughout the Midwest. This is about protecting regional economy, the fishing industry, and the livelihoods of all of us who rely on the water for our jobs. This invasive species significantly alter the habitat. They crowd out native fish and are also a threat to boaters. Now, I've worked very closely with Senator Toomey, the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission, along with legislators who represent that potentially affected area, to both study and develop plans of action to deal with these invasive species. Just so we understand, this is one measure. The Great Lakes fisheries generate U.S. economic activity of approximately $7 billion. That's $7 billion annually. And our native fish populations like walleye, perch, and lake herring would be devastated by the invasion, the Asian carp establishment, threatening this industry and the livelihoods of all those who depend on this ecosystem's health. I want to thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to bring this forward, and I hope in the future we can take a look at it, but I am going to withdraw the amendment. Thank you very much. Now
Will the gentleman yield? Will the gentleman yield?
Without objection, the amendment is withdrawn.
Okay.
To ask him about his point of order. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Ohio seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I move to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, I seek to identify my side with the gentleman's remarks on the importance of the Asian carp issue to the freshwater lakes of our country, and certainly to Lake Erie. He and I share that. The lake is neither Republican nor Democratic. It is the largest fishery in the entire Great Lakes system, which contain 20% of the world's fresh surface water. And Lake Erie actually has more fish than all the other Great Lakes combined. Honestly, this Asian carp threat is truly a nightmare for those people in the multi-billion-dollar industries, the maritime industries, our fisheries, our tourism centers, and I especially appreciate the gentleman's desire to have a multi-agency effort and more dispatch within the executive branch to deal with the possibility of these fish, these very destructive fish, coming in and destroying our perch, our walleye, our native fish. It is a very, very worrisome invasive species to our lakes. Did the gentleman wish to make further comment?
If the gentlelady would yield. I want to thank you very much for your comments.